While the world tests for the virus is testing us all. At DBS, it's testing our ability to think, feel and act beyond ourselves. That's when we see portraits of courage, perseverance and generosity. These are the portraits of purpose we're creating to bring more of what the world needs today, for all of us, for all our tomorrows, together.
Hello everyone, I'm Dan Maxey, Executive Editor at Time and Editorial Director of the TIME100, and you're watching this week's first edition of TIME100 Talks. Today's show focuses on the power of global leadership. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues its far-reaching economic effects and changes everything as we know it, leaders across the world are working to reopen and rebuild, seizing this moment to create a post-COVID world that is better and stronger and more resilient than ever before. Joining us today is United Nations Secretary General António Guterres. He will be speaking with Time correspondent Justin Warland about how the UN needs to respond to the global pandemic. Time Africa Bureau Chief Aaron Baker will be in conversation with Ghanaian entrepreneur Fred Swaniker. They will discuss how African youth are taking the lead in proposing solutions on how to rebuild a better Africa post-COVID. Time contributor Kim Dozier will be speaking with Julia Gillard, the 27th Prime Minister of Australia, on how female leaders are responding to the pandemic. Award-winning actress Michelle Yeoh will give us insight on what it's like filming a movie during the pandemic, and she'll also talk about how COVID-19 is shaping her advocacy work as a United Nations DP Goodwill ambassador. Plus, we will have a special message and performance from K-pop group Red Velvet, IRENE SEULGI. Before we kick things off, I would like to thank our sponsor, DBS, for all they've done to make these important conversations possible. Now, to get us started, here's a wonderful message from Red Velvet, IRENE SEULGI, shouting out frontline workers and their fans.
해피니스, 안녕하세요. 레드벨벳 아이린 슬기입니다. 네, 이렇게 뜻깊은 행사에 함께하게 되어 기쁘고 영광입니다. 네, 코로나19로 인해 모두가 힘든 시기에 밤낮으로 애써주시는 의료진 분들께 진심으로 감사드린다는 말씀 드리고 싶습니다. 네, 그리고 항상 저희를 사랑해주시는 팬분들에게도 감사드립니다. 팬분들의 응원이 있기에 저희가 큰 힘을 얻고 또 이 자리에 있을 수 있다고 생각이 드는데요. 어려운 시기지만 지치지 말고 긍정적인 마음으로 힘내셨으면 좋겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you, ladies, for that special message, and we look forward to hearing from you later in the show with a fun performance. Up next, my colleague Justin Warland will be speaking with United Nations Secretary General António Guterres. Justin?
Thanks, Dan. I'm Justin Warland. I'm a correspondent at Time, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by the UN Secretary General, António Guterres. Thank you so much for being here.
It's a great pleasure.
A few weeks ago, you delivered an address on inequality, and you referred to, I quote, an inequality pandemic that's gripping the world. Can you tell us a bit more about what you meant by that, and why is right now the right time to be talking about inequality?
Well, first of all, inequality is a dramatic source of injustice in today's world. Just to give one number, 26 people have the same amount of wealth as half of the world population, which is absolutely unacceptable from the moral point of view. But this level of inequality makes countries much more fragile in relation to a pandemic, because a large chunk of the population, especially in the developing world, lives in very dramatic circumstances and is extremely vulnerable to the pandemic. And on the other hand, inequality is an obstacle to development. If the middle class is squeezed, if a large part of the population has no buying power, that of course limits the capacity of economic growth and development. And on the other hand, inequality is not only a question of income and wealth. Inequality is also linked to race, to ethnicity, to family, Many people, to a certain extent, have their life determined by their conditions at birth, which is totally unacceptable. And all these forms of inequality are interlinked. You see, for instance, in a country like the United States, the Afro-American community is much more dramatically impacted by the COVID-19 than other communities. So the inequality is not only something that is unacceptable from the point of view of social justice, but it is an additional factor of fragility in relation to pandemics, in relation to climate change, and in relation to the capacity of development of a country and of the strengthening of the democratic institutions and the human rights development in each country.
You referred to the pandemic just a second ago, and of course there's a race for a vaccine. Are you concerned that wealthy countries are striking deals with manufacturers? Are you concerned about access to the vaccine in developing countries and also to underserved populations in wealthy countries?
I am very concerned. I'm very concerned because I see the emergence of a vaccine nationalism. And we see a number of initiatives by several developed countries in order to try to guarantee vaccines as soon as they are available to their population, and not enough effort being made to consider vaccine as new forms of treatment that might emerge as a global public good. I usually use the expression a people's vaccine, because we need to consider this fact. Nobody is safe unless everybody is safe. So just to have vaccine in the developed world and not to have vaccines available for the developing countries will not allow for the eradication of the disease. And then the disease comes back. And we know that it is not yet clear how effective the vaccine will be, how much time the immunity will last. And so one reason more to have a strong bet in a global effort, a coordinated effort, to make sure that the vaccine is made available and affordable everywhere in the world. And in my opinion, there was an initiative, so-called the ACT initiative, in which the World Health Organization, several other vaccine-related international agencies, many countries were involved. It's very important that this effort that is lacking funding at the present moment, they would need $39 billion, they have only $4 billion, that this effort is boosted, and that all is done for an effective international cooperation, allowing a vaccine to be an effective tool of the whole of the universe and not just of some countries, because that would not be fair, but on the other hand, would not work, because as I said, either we will all be free of the disease or nobody will be free.
Do you think that creditors, wealthy creditors, should be forgiving some of the debt and helping developing countries out of this difficult situation?
Of course, the answer is yes, but it's more than that. If you look at what's happening in Europe, in the United States, in other developed countries, trillions of US dollars were injected in the economies. The countries have the capacity to do so. And sometimes they can print money because that money is universally accepted. And unfortunately, developing countries cannot do the same. So for developing countries to be able to have the same capacity as developed countries have had to support their economies, to support the families, to support the small businesses, they need a massive injection of resources. I've been advocating for the possibility of a new issuance of special drawing rights by the International Monetary Fund that should be made available to the developing world. It is clear that we need international financial institutions to be boosted in their capacity to support the developing countries, to allow them to have the same kind of measures to their economies that we see in the developed world. For instance, if you consider the percentage of gross domestic product that has been injected in developed economies, it is around at least 10% of the economy. The same in the African continent would be 200 billion US dollars. So it's absolutely essential to make those available. On the other hand, many of these countries are trapped in debt. And if some have the capacity to access financial markets, many have not that capacity. And some measures were taken. The G20 approved a program for the least developed countries, for the poorest countries, of suspension of payments of the debt. But the problem is not only for those least developed countries. The problem is in general for the developing world, and even many middle-income countries need to be looked at seriously. I am strongly supportive of a suspension in those countries that have no capacity to access financial markets, of suspension of payments during a certain period. And then I believe that a program of debt relief and debt restructuring will be required. And I think that the international community as a whole need to look at this seriously. Because if we have a cascade of bankruptcies at national level, we might then move into more than a recession, into a depression in the global economy, and the impact would be devastating for us all.
Well, in your address, you called for a, quote, new social contract, which includes policies like universal health care, consideration of universal basic income. These would be really bold changes in a lot of places. And I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about how you think that might actually come to be, what actually needs to happen in order to make those a reality.
Well, the truth is that we see today in the world a huge mistrust of peoples in relation to their political establishments, even in relation to international organizations. And we absolutely need to restore that trust. And people see in many countries not only inequality, but they see corruption, bad governance. They see that their main needs are not addressed, that political establishments tend to leave them behind, to ignore them, and that the benefits of globalization and of technological development are not evenly distributed, and to a certain extent that they contribute to inequality in itself. And my belief is that we need to strengthen the social cohesion of societies, and we need to reestablish trust between societies and political establishments at national level and at global level. And in this regard, I feel that a very important factor is a massive investment in education and in access to digital technologies as an equalizer and as enabler. And I'm talking about quality education. I'm talking about education in which we learn how to learn, and we don't limit ourselves to learn things because things are changing so quickly. And at the same time, it's no longer education only at the school age, but education, lifelong learning is the new approach. I believe we need a new set of innovations in social protection. Universal health coverage today is recognized as something that is absolutely essential, and we see the pandemic as a demonstration of that. But also people are more and more looking into instruments like basic income available and others, which according to the different situation of countries can have different shapes. I would not recommend a universal method. I think that each country has its own social structure, its own needs, its own problems. What is important is to understand that we need an effective social protection, and at the same time that we need to create conditions for the business community, the civil society, the youth, to be part of the decision-making system. Political establishments need to open up, to be inclusive, and to understand that today governments alone cannot do it. Businesses, civil society, the youth are absolutely essential in what I call a new social contract, in which it is possible to mobilize the energies and resources of a country to the benefit of the whole population, and requiring also at the global level, because the capacity to do it in the developed world is easier than in developing countries, a new global deal for a fair globalization that would benefit everybody. And this is not, I mean, some people think that this is very difficult, or I think this is the interest of everybody. What we are seeing now with the pandemic or with climate change or with other fragilities that the world has is that not to have a fair globalization, not to give all countries the capacity to address these fragilities makes the whole world fragile and makes the developed countries themselves vulnerable to the threats that we face in the present world.
Well, let's talk about one of those issues, climate change. You've called for countries to consider green recovery, to think about spending on measures that are both will help them out of the economic threat, but also help on addressing climate change for years to come. A lot of the data we've seen thus far is not so encouraging in terms of how countries are responding and addressing climate change out of the pandemic. What can be done to turn that tide? And do you have hope that that will be done?
Well, first of all, with the pandemic, many people have been, to a certain extent, forgetting that the threat of climate change is there, and is there in a way that is more and more relevant every single day. The last 5 years are the hottest ever. The last decade was the hottest ever. And we are seeing devastating impacts in economies and in societies. Just to give an example, pollution causes 7 million annual deaths that are totally avoidable. And this has a dramatic human cost and a dramatic economic cost for societies. And when we see what's happening with glaciers melting, when the storms that are destroying more and more countries and regions, and sometimes in vulnerable situations with a dramatic humanitarian impact, when we see all these, it is clear that climate change remains the defining threat of our age. And we need to take profit of the present situation, because with the recovery, trillions of US dollars will be invested. And it's not indifferent to decide how to invest them. I strongly believe that if we invest in a green economy, if we stop subsidies to fossil fuels, if we don't bail out polluting industries, if you are able coal, for instance, it doesn't make any sense to go on producing coal power plants when today it's cheaper to produce energy with solar or with wind. So this is an opportunity to use this massive investment that is being implemented at the present moment and will be in the next few years. It's an opportunity to do it right, to build back better. And one of the key components of building it back better is building green, is building sustainable. And you can choose what kind of infrastructure you are going to bet in, either an infrastructure that is open to the green economy or an infrastructure that will lock us during decades in the grey economy that has no future. And what makes me be optimistic to a certain extent is to see more and more businesses, asset managers, cities understanding that, and more betting on the need to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 as a way to limit to 1.5 degrees the temperature growth in the end of the century. More than 1,000 big businesses, more than 500 big cities, 120 countries have already decided that they will fully respect this carbon neutrality project, this zero carbon project for 2050. But they only represent 25% of the emissions. The question is the big emitters. Now, it's true that in Europe we have a movement in this direction, but we have the United States, we have China, we have Japan, we have India, we have Russia. It's essential that all big emitters understand the need to commit themselves, and we have now an opportunity for that with the COP26 and with the review of the so-called national determined contributions. All big emitters must understand that they need to commit themselves to carbon neutrality by 2050 and to an increase of no more than 1.5 degrees in the end of the century. Because if things go on as they are today, the last estimates show that we will come to the end of the century with an increase of about 3 to 5 degrees, and that would be absolutely devastating to human life in the planet.
I want to ask about a little bit about your personal story. We live right now in a time where authoritarian governments are on the rise. Of course, you grew up in Portugal under the last days of the Salazar regime, and you started in politics shortly after the Salazar regime ended. For those in our audience who might not know, the authoritarian leader of Portugal for many decades. And I'm just curious, how did that experience shape your work now? How do you think about your experience as a young man growing up in Portugal?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's very important to have an experience in handling the problems of a region or of a country or of a city to understand global problems. I mean, many of the issues that we have discussed in Portugal, we created a minimum guaranteed income for families, for instance, and we made a bet on universal health coverage, and this was decades ago. And Portugal is not a very rich country, as you know. So that experience was very important. But I would say that the experience that marked my life was as 10 years as High Commissioner for Refugees. When one looks at today's world, we cannot forget that many people are vulnerable, but some of them are the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. And when one looks at the obstacles that refugees today face, the borders that are closed, the fact that conflicts are going on and more people are forced to flee, the difficulties even in relation to the traditional migration, we understand that this population really is in dramatic circumstances and they are extremely vulnerable on top of that to COVID-19. And it's absolutely essential that all the measures taken to address COVID-19 are also available for refugee and migrant populations. But it was the experience of dealing with the refugee drama, of being able to connect with them everywhere in the world, in the most remote locations, understanding their problems, feeling their courage and their resilience, that I got, I would say, the most important inspiration in my life that is extremely useful in trying to do what I'm trying to do now as Secretary General of the United Nations.
Two of the biggest, the largest economies, the two of the most powerful countries, the US and China, are in sort of a state of constant conflict over a variety of different issues. And I'm just curious, you know, how difficult does that make your job, and what are you trying to do to navigate that terrain?
Well, it surely doesn't make my job easy, and it makes the navigation difficult. But more important than my job is the situation of the world. The relationship between the biggest powers, US and China, or US and Russia, has never been as dysfunctional as it is today. We see the difficulties in the Security Council to take measures in relation to the need to prevent crises and to solve crises. Look at the situation in Libya, where you have resolutions for an arms embargo, and you have several countries violating those resolutions in total impunity, and how difficult it is to create the conditions to bring them together into the end of hostilities, a ceasefire, and a political solution. And on the other hand, this divide, namely the economic divide, risks to create two blocks with two dominant currencies, with two sets of trade rules, two different internets, two strategies in artificial intelligence, and then inevitably two geostrategic and military strategies, and that is a huge risk for the world. I'm a strong believer that the fragilities we have in relation to pandemics, to climate change, to the lawlessness in cyberspace, to the risks of nuclear confrontation again, all these fragilities would justify the need, independently of the differences that exist. We have different systems, we have different interests. It's not easy to make the international community come together, but the threats we face and the fragilities we face should force all to understand that what unites us is more important than what divides us. My appeal is for countries to be able, understanding their differences and understanding how complex it is, but my appeal is for countries to be able to come together and to have a common strategy to address COVID, to have a common strategy to address climate change, and also to be able to transform the enormous evolution that we are witnessing in technology, the digitalization of the world, in something to the benefit of all humankind and not in a new threat for the international community.
How are you reforming the UN? How should the UN be reformed in order to best address this? I mean, you mentioned in your address that I talked about earlier that international institutions need to evolve in order to address this moment. What do you think should happen at the UN to address this moment?
I think we need to recognize one thing. The UN, of course, has many problems, many difficulties, but there is one thing the UN managed. It is to avoid a third world war. The biggest period of peace among biggest powers. There are many small conflicts or conflicts of medium dimension in the world. But since the Second World War, we did not have any confrontation, military confrontation amongst big powers. And this is a remarkable historic achievement. No other period in human history had such a large epoch of peace among the most important powers. But having said so, it is clear that we have lots of small conflicts unresolved, lots of people suffering. It is clear that we need to be able to create a much more effective international strategy in relation to sustainable development, in relation to climate change, in relation to human rights. And in all these areas, I see the UN, but a UN reformed, a UN more modernized, more effective, more cost-effective. I see the UN still playing a very important role as a platform where countries can come together, but not only governments. And one of the problems we have is that until now, essentially, the international community has lived based on intergovernmental organizations. I think we need a more inclusive multilateralism. We need to bring the business community. We need to bring the civil society. We need to bring the cities, the regions into the decision-making processes in order to make sure that we are able to address together the dramatic challenges that we face. And I believe, and we made that experience with our high-level panel on digital cooperation, I believe that many of these actors still see the UN as a platform where they are ready to be present, to discuss, to cooperate, and to find new forms of regulation, less rigid, more flexible, more multi-stakeholder, and more able to address the ever-changing problems of today's world. So changing the UN, making it more effective, more cost-effective, networking it with all other international organizations is still, in my opinion, a fundamental priority to have a global governments able to contribute to a fair globalization and to contribute to more peace, better development, and more respect for human rights in the world.
So does that take you away from the fundamental working with member states to make it more of a multi-stakeholder approach?
It doesn't take me away. We need to go on working with member states, but we need member states to understand that they are not the only actors that are relevant in today's world. And it's in their interest that other key actors also play a role in the finding of solutions that we need in all areas where we face challenges in the present times.
Well, Mr. Secretary General, thank you so much for taking the time. Greatly appreciate it.
It was a great pleasure.
If you haven't already, follow Time on social media and use the hashtag Time100Talks to join the conversation. Which global leaders do you think are doing the best job navigating the pandemic, and why? Up next, we have Time Africa Bureau Chief Aaron Baker and Ghanaian entrepreneur Fred Swaniker. Aaron?
Hi, I'm Aaron Baker, Time's Africa Bureau Chief, and I'm joined by Ghanaian entrepreneur and leadership expert Fred Swaniker. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aaron. Nice to see you.
Fred, by 2035, Africa will have the world's largest and youngest workforce. How important is cultivating leadership in this generation, and why?
Well, I believe that developing the next generation of African leaders is one of the most important challenges that we need to address, not only in Africa, but for the whole world. Because you can just imagine if 1 billion young people on the continent of Africa do not have access to opportunity. This is a ticking time bomb. And so what we do in Africa this century will determine where the world goes. And that's why it's such a critical issue to address.
And you've often spoken about Africa's crisis in leadership, not just limited to governments, but in all areas of society. What's at the root of this crisis, and what are some of the solutions that have been proposed specifically from the youth?
Well, what we have in Africa is a continent that is fast growing and that faces many grand challenges. We have challenges in healthcare, education, with infrastructure, with empowerment of women. And there's so many problems that have been solved in other parts of the world that we still unfortunately face here in Africa, civil conflict, etc. So, and yet we have the youngest population in the world. The average age in Africa is 19 years old compared to 47 in Germany or Japan. So if Africa is going to have its issues solved, it needs to be solved by the youth because they make up 60% of the population. And the good thing about youth is that they are still not yet jaded by the world. And they are naive enough to imagine better solutions for the world. And so therefore, I believe that Africa's young population is its greatest treasure. And it's going to be the source of innovation that's going to address many of these challenges that I've just talked about. And what we therefore need to do is to harness this potential and convert it into energy that can really address the continent's challenges and therefore the world's challenges.
Are you seeing anything in particularly in the situation of the pandemic like COVID where youth are taking the lead or proposing solutions?
Yes, there are many solutions. I mean, one of the things that's exciting me the most is that young people are realizing that because of the pandemic, jobs are going to be much less available on the continent. And so I'm seeing lots of inspiring examples of entrepreneurship that are arising. One of the young leaders that I work with is a young woman here in Kenya who has started an hydroponics farm, leveraging technology and vertical farming to grow, crops in parts of urban Nairobi. And she's building a business around that. There's another young man in Cape Town called Spencer who is leveraging airships to transport cargo across Africa to reach parts that are off the grid, so that the least accessible parts of Africa can therefore be connected to global supply chains and have their the products from their villages reach global markets and vice versa. And these are young people who are coming up with innovative ideas. Because one of the things that I believe is that constraints drives innovation. And we have a lot of constraints in Africa. And so that therefore means there's going to be a lot of innovation coming out of Africa, and the young people are the ones driving it.
And on the leadership in terms of governance, I mean, we've seen how COVID-19 has exacerbated and highlighted the poor leadership that we see around the world. Would you have liked to have seen better responses by our current leaders? And what are some of the reasons for those failures?
I mean, this era has really shown the life and death consequences of leadership. And I've been encouraged by some of the great examples of leadership that I've been seeing on the public sector. The best examples I'm seeing have actually come from the women who are leading countries, in countries like Germany and New Zealand, Taiwan, where we've seen women who are leading their countries seem to be handling this pandemic in a far better way than the male leaders we have. So one of the lessons that I'm taking from this pandemic is that we need more women to run countries around the world, and we're going to have hopefully better outcomes. I'm also seeing some encouraging examples right here in Africa. I think that African leaders, by and large, took this a lot more seriously than in some other parts of the world. And the pandemic hasn't risen in Africa as much as it has in the rest in other parts of the world, and they were very fast to take it seriously and imposed lockdowns where were needed, but also started thinking about what are the unique solutions that we need here in Africa. So it hasn't been taken frivolously by African leaders for the most part, and we've seen some really exciting collaborations like between the Africa Centers for Disease Control and global organizations to really try to put in place measures to ensure that we're able to address the crisis as best as possible. So in times of adversity, this is really when character is shown.
Yeah. So far, we're looking at more than 1 million COVID-19 cases in Africa, and quite possibly a lot more given the low rate of testing. Earlier in the outbreak, public health officials were predicting catastrophic outcomes for Africa that we haven't yet seen, but I mean, we still might. How do you imagine Africa changing post-COVID? And what will it take to turn this crisis into an incentive to improve?
Well, one of the things that, as I look to the future post-COVID, it's clear that there's going to be a global economic recession. And therefore, one of the biggest challenges that Africa is going to face is that it's going to become much harder to grow our economies because our economies are so linked to the rest of the world. And it's going to be much harder to create jobs. And we've just talked about how that is one of the biggest challenges that the continent is facing. So these are things that are going to become much more difficult post-pandemic. However, as I mentioned before, I really believe that constraints drives innovation. And so these increased constraints are going to drive, I believe, innovation in a few areas. First, I think we're going to see a much more digitized Africa. And so I see opportunities for us to drive education, health, supply chains, etc., by leveraging technology. And this, therefore, can speed up access to these critical needs in Africa, which is a positive. I also see an opportunity for African youth to be able to access work not only in Africa, but globally, because one of the things that we've learned in the pandemic is that we can all work remotely. And therefore, before, as we're trying to address the jobs challenge in Africa, we had to think about placing youth in jobs only in the continent. But now you can imagine a situation where young Africans can work remotely, but without leaving the continent, and therefore we can create jobs without the brain drain. You can imagine an engineer from Kenya working for Siemens in Germany, or a designer from Nigeria working for Zara or H&M in Europe, and they're doing this from their home country. So this is an exciting opportunity, but it's only going to happen if we can invest in broadband and improve our human capital so that we can make it available to the rest of the world, but without them leaving the continent physically. And finally, I see some great innovations in terms of access to markets as we become more plugged into global e-commerce markets. We should be able to export our products and services not only in Africa, not only to other African countries, but digitally through the rest of the world. So these are things that I believe, if we really reimagine how we live and do business on the continent, we can actually turn into an opportunity and not just a crisis.
I mean, your focus is on education, and right now we're looking at schools worldwide closed. In-person learning is at a standstill. While your university, the African Leadership University, uses some digital elements in the curriculum, you emphasize the need for group interaction, teamwork, hands-on experience. Is there a way to improve online education in the post-COVID world? And what does that look like?
I believe that the future of education is one in which you're blending online experiences with offline experiences, because research shows that online-only experiences are not the most effective. If you look at the massive open online courses that were launched a few years ago, only about 8 to 10% of people finish programs, because at the end of the day, learning is a social activity. And if you're doing it only by yourself or you're doing it online and you're not interacting with others, it's very hard to remain engaged. So I believe the best models will leverage access to the world's best content, because now you don't have to only be stuck with those bad few teachers or professors that you might have at your institution. You can access the best in the world anyway. But then you need to blend that with in-person experiences. So you can imagine groups of students, pods meeting outside of Zoom, in person, in coffee shops, in real estate that is now much more available in their cities, because perhaps as shops close, they might become meeting centers for young people to gather and do the peer-to-peer learning and projects, etc. I also believe we need to integrate learning much more into the real world. There's research that shows that to effectively develop your talent in an area, only 10% of it can be learned through formal classroom teaching, whether it's in person or online. 20% comes from what they call developmental relationships with your mentors and peers and coaches. And 70% comes from experience. We learn best by doing. Yet today, most education is only focused on that 10%. So we're only unlocking 10% of human potential. And so I believe that post-COVID, we really need to lean into this 10, 20, 70 rule more. A lot more learning by doing, a lot more integration to the real world, doing projects, working on really becoming problem solvers and not just memorizing facts and figures. And I also believe we need a greater focus on entrepreneurship so that young people are coming out ready to create their own livelihood and not simply waiting to get jobs. And finally, I think we need to look at how we integrate the development of character and ethics into education so that we are able to really create ethical problem solvers for the world. So these are things that I believe have nothing to do with technology. It's really just a reframing of the purpose of education. And I think we need to take this moment to really create young people that are ready to solve the world's problems and not simply memorizing facts and figures. So this is what I really hope happens.
You mention entrepreneurship quite often, and we have a tendency, the world often has a tendency to look to the innovators and entrepreneurs of Silicon Valley for examples of next generation leadership. Is that something that can be replicated in Africa? And what does that take? How do you cultivate that class of entrepreneurs here?
Well, first of all, when I use the word entrepreneurship, I don't mean it purely in the sense of people who are starting for-profit businesses. I believe that entrepreneurship is a way of thinking. Entrepreneurs are people who solve difficult challenges in creative ways with limited resources. And that's the situation we face in Africa, and that's the situation that the world is going into. So we therefore need people who think a lot more like entrepreneurs. But you can have entrepreneurial thinking in politics, as political leaders. You can have entrepreneurial thinking in the social sector as well as in business. And when I think about the model that we need here in Africa, I don't believe we need the Silicon Valley model, because the Silicon Valley model glorifies the unicorn. If you haven't sold your company for $1 billion in 2 years with 18 employees, then you haven't succeeded. And it's very focused on trying to create as much value as possible with as few jobs as possible. In Africa, we need to do the other way around. We need to create value with as many jobs as possible. And if you look at, say, China's economy, 60% of their GDP comes from 30 million SMEs, small companies that are employing 100 to 500 people. And they are driving most of the employment. So I think what we need in Africa is not the unicorn, but perhaps a camel, which is camels are sturdy. They are able to withstand difficult times, and they don't need a lot of capital. They don't need a lot of water, right? Which you can think of as the capital that we need to start businesses. So therefore, we need a different model that is going to also be focused a lot more on solving real problems, not simply creating the next music dancing app that seems the norm in Silicon Valley. We have real problems here in Africa to solve. I mentioned earlier some of those challenges: healthcare, education, climate change, youth unemployment, the empowerment of women. What do we do with our natural resources? Wildlife conservation. And so I believe ultimately entrepreneurs are driven by their passion to solve problems. And so let's harness the entrepreneurship in Africa around these big challenges. And then what we're doing is not only creating jobs and wealth, but we're also transforming the lives of our everyday citizens. And that's the model that we need in Africa.
So what's an example of a camel you're betting on or you would like to see?
Well, I think agriculture is a huge opportunity. We spend about $40 billion a year importing food into Africa, that we have perfect soil conditions to grow, and we have abundant rain and sunshine. So I'm betting on a lot of young people who are building the agri-businesses of the future. And this is not just farming, but it's things like, agri, processing and, supply chain logistics and agri-tech and all these other parts of the value chain that are needed. 70% of the world's cocoa is produced in Ghana and Ivory Coast, but yet we don't have any global chocolate brands. So we need to build our own, Nestle's and Lindt, etc. And these are the kinds of businesses that I'm excited about and that I'm seeing some of our young people foraying into.
I'm excited for the idea of an African chocolate bar, no problem. Finally, with so much bad news happening around the world, can you talk about the one thing you're seeing now in Africa that really gives you hope for the future?
Yes, the one thing that I'm seeing in Africa that gives me hope for the future is really a generation of women who are stepping up and leading. And, you know, in order for Africa to realize its full potential, 50% of our population needs to more actively participate in creating that future. And so as more young women are stepping up and being educated and going into leadership and entrepreneurship, I think that this is a trend that is going to really improve outcomes. Studies also show that as women get more education, they have fewer children, and therefore, you know, that's also going to have a great effect in development in Africa. And so these are that for me is a positive trend that I'm excited about now, that I want to invest a lot more in, because if we can develop women in Africa, the ripple effects are going to be really, really outstanding.
Thank you so much, Fred, for taking the time to speak with us on TIME100 Talks.
Thank you, Erin, and great to see you again.
Thank you, Erin and Fred, for that great conversation. We're now going from Africa to Australia for our next conversation. Time contributor Kim Dozier will be joined by Australia's 27th Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. Kim?
Thank you, Dan. I'm Kim Dozier, a Time contributor, and I'm joined by Julia Gillard, the 27th Australian Prime Minister. Ms. Gillard, welcome.
Thank you, Kim. Great to be with you.
Well, I'd like to start with the news that we're all living right now, a global pandemic with no end in sight. The one possibly positive thing about the pandemic is that it has highlighted the global leadership of women, like New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern and Germany's Angela Merkel. What do you think the pandemic has shown us about what women's leadership can bring at a crisis like this?
I'm always a little careful when we talk about women's leadership, because I'm not a believer that, you know, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, that men and women's brains are somehow inherently different and that means that they always lead differently. But men and women have certainly been socialised differently. And because we perceive women leaders through the prism of gender still, we tend to give political consent to female leaders if they come across as both strong and empathetic. They can't look weak, otherwise we don't think that they've got what it takes to lead, but they must look empathetic as well, otherwise we think that they're kind of, you know, nasty and unlikable. So it's no surprise to me that because women leaders tend to exhibit those character traits, that they've come to the fore during a global pandemic when all of us want to know that our leaders have got what it takes to get us through, but we want them to understand how we're feeling emotionally in this time of great anxiety as well.
So it's their skill at emotional intelligence that is the added benefactor that a lot of male leaders don't necessarily get training in growing up.
I think we can certainly say this is a time in which that absolute strongman, blustering, crash-through style of leadership, I'm thinking here of people like President Bolsonaro of Brazil, that style of leadership hasn't worked. You might be able to bluff your way through a series of political crises, but you can't do it with a virus. You've got to be precise, you've got to be scientific. Angela Merkel, because of her scientific training, has certainly shown that ability. Jacinda Ardern has certainly shown the sort of nurturing, empathetic kindness that I think people are looking for. So I do hope that we emerge out of this with a new dialogue around women's leadership, a new understanding about the benefits of combining strength and empathy in our leaders. And we ask that of all leaders, men and women, because we've got a lot to do in this world, and clearly we need the best people trying to steer us as we confront the aftermath of the global pandemic.
Now, I'd like to talk about your time as the leader in Australia. You tried for the first couple of years to ignore the sexism thing. And then you gave your famous misogyny speech, as it's now called, that still got millions of hits on YouTube, where you had reached the end of your rope with the leader of the opposition. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about? And do you think anything's changed for women in your country?
Well, let me start with the positive news. I do think things have changed. I think things have changed here in Australia, and I think they're changing around the world, but nowhere near fast enough. We need to see a far greater pace of change. What's certainly changed here in Australia is when I was Prime Minister, the fashionable political commentary was that no part of how I was being received as Prime Minister was because of my gender, that was just irrelevant, and everybody was reacting to me exactly the same way that they would have reacted to a man in the same circumstances. Now, of course, we're having a lively debate here and around the world about women in leadership, a debate that I've sought to contribute to through co-authoring a book on women in leadership to talk about all of these experiences. So that's the positive news. For me, back in 2012, I did get to a stage, having not engaged on issues of sexism, where I was in a parliamentary circumstance where I knew that we would be talking about sexism that day. There were a very specific set of circumstances. The Speaker of our House of Representatives had been shown to have sent some very sexist text messages, so that was going to be the topic of the day. I went in ready for what we have as question time, ready to answer questions about the Speaker, but instead we moved straight into a debate, and what's become known as the misogyny speech was my speech in reply to the Leader of the Opposition, and I think it did unleash all of the frustration that I'd felt up until that moment.
Now, I realize that Tony Abbott never said, "ditch the witch." That was a sign that he was standing next to, but he said a lot of other unkind things to a woman politician. Did you ever get an apology from him?
No, I didn't. And look, I wouldn't really expect one either. I think in Australia we play our parliamentary politics hard. I certainly was of the view then, and I'm still of the view now, that much of the way it was played against me was relying on sexist stereotypes, and I'm not just personalising that to the Leader of the Opposition. I think that happened more broadly than him in the Parliament, in the media, in the commentariat generally, when people came to Parliament House holding up signs, "ditch the witch," and calling me a bitch and things like that. Clearly, gender was at the forefront. But rather than look back and think about apologies or anything like that, my outlook has been to take those experiences and to see what we can all learn from them and to then look forward. So that's led me to working with King's College London on a Global Institute for Women's Leadership. So we're deepening the research base about what enables women to come through for leadership, and then writing with my dear colleague, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, a book which we hope globally will help people, men and women, think about what we need to do to create a world where women can come through for leadership without artificial barriers in their way.
Now, I wanted to talk about your book, Women in Leadership, it's called. It's out in the Pacific region where you are. It's coming out in the United States next February. You interviewed 8 women leaders, current and former, including people like Hillary Clinton. What were some of the common lessons and wisdom you found across their different experiences and yours?
What I really learned in doing these interviews and in writing the book is 2 things. I mean, one, we interviewed women from incredibly different circumstances. You know, Hillary Clinton, Erna Solberg in Norway, Theresa May in the United Kingdom, Jacinda in New Zealand, and the list goes on. But we also interviewed Ellen Johnson Sirleaf from Liberia, Joyce Banda from Malawi. And you would think at first instance that those cultures and contexts are so different that there wouldn't be much shared experience. And yet what we found was, you know, sexism and its manifestations are effectively universal. Whilst the amplitude of them varies from place to place, the way women leaders live that experience has so much in common. So that really surprised me. Another thing that really was very much reinforced in my mind from working on the book is we take the research that's been done about women in leadership, often in sort of laboratory style conditions, universities, testing how people see women leaders using groups of students or the like, and we tried to see how much of that lived in the real world. Most of it did. And so the research that shows that we quickly conclude that women leaders are unlikable, for example, those sexist stereotypes we still have whispering in the back of all of our brains do still translate into lived reality for women leaders.
Now, you have talked about being put on a pedestal as a woman's leader is a mug's game because everyone expects the women that they have to perform better than everybody else. What do you mean by that?
I think there's a tendency, and as someone who's spent a lifetime in the women's movement, I'm going to own up to this tendency as much as anybody else in the world, that when we see a woman come through in what has historically been a domain for men, we all just say, you know, that's an amazing achievement, and we should say that. But then we do tend to put her on a pedestal. It's the sort of golden girl phenomenon, as if because she's been the first to get through, that she is, you know, without flaw. She is perfect. She is to almost be venerated because she is so remarkable. And the trap in that for the woman leader is as soon as she does something, not even wrong, just human, you know, perhaps a little short-tempered in a moment, a little bit more aggressive than people have come to expect, a lapse in a demeanour of kindness, then there's the crash off the pedestal and the woman falls in community expectations and community support. And we'd be better off to say, we want women to come through. Yes, remarkable women do come through, but they will always be a mix of strengths and weaknesses, and we shouldn't create a high jump bar for them, which is higher than we expect male leaders to clear. We should be looking at the same standard, so not expecting perfection because, you know what, there isn't a human being on the planet who's perfect, and there's no woman going for leadership who's going to be perfect.
So situations where a short-tempered man is passionate, a short-tempered woman is she unstable? That kind of double standard you're talking about.
Oh, exactly. A woman who has done assertive things, perhaps been on a parliamentary committee or inquiry where she's very assertively, even aggressively questioned a witness. A man who did that would be seen as, you know, going after it, as making sure that the truth came out, as being tough, as being strong. A woman doing that, very likely to be described as nasty. In fact, it's caught my eye that one of the first things that President Trump has said about Kamala Harris is he's used the word nasty. So I think he's already conjuring with these sexist tropes that women who come forward, who are ambitious and rightly ambitious, who have got the capacity to lead, who have done in the past strong things, are unlikable. He's basically already wanting people to conclude that they, you know, won't warm to Kamala Harris as the candidate for vice president. And there's gender baked into that.
And if you were her, what advice would you give her?
Well, she's a very, very experienced person, so I don't know if she needs my advice, but what we certainly say in the book for women who are aspiring is, you know, we'd love to be able to say you will step out into a world of gender equality, but the reality is you won't. You'll step out into a world where there's still a disproportionate focus on your appearance, a disproportionate focus on your family structures, where if you fall the wrong side of this strength and empathy tightrope, that people may conclude that you're really unlikable, that you're really prickly, that you're hard to get along with. We say in the book, and the evidence shows this, that there's less circumference for women to make errors, that if they make a mistake, then they get more of a payback than men. So I would say to any woman aspiring for leadership, be aware these things are going to happen, and war game in advance what your response is going to be. Don't be blindsided, don't be caught in the moment. I'm sure Kamala Harris, having watched Hillary Clinton in 2016, that she and her team are well across these aspects.
Now, I've also noticed that after leaving office, you've mostly stayed away from politics, whereas a lot of your colleagues have spoken loud and clear about their thoughts about current events. Why have you taken that step back?
Well, I took a step back from Australian domestic contemporary politics. I formed the view that having served as Prime Minister, that when that period came to an end, that it was time to move on and to build the next bit of my life, and that it wasn't fair to the current generation that's still in there, particularly my Labor colleagues, for me to be looming up over their shoulder with my daily advice about what to do next. They're a talented generation, they'll work it out. If anybody needs my advice or perspective, they can obviously pick up the phone and get it privately. I don't have to be on the airwaves doing that. So better for them, but ultimately too, better for me, because if I was going to move on to a productive next stage in my life, then I needed to leave that day-to-day political contest behind and get on with the next bit, and that's what I'm doing now.
Well, if I could try one political question, Australia is in a deep recession. It's facing rising tensions with China. What does the nation need to do to remain a positive force in the region at this time?
Oh, look, I'm hugely confident Australia will be a positive force in the region, and I'm happy to say that because in my view that's a commentary almost above and beyond politics. We are a nation that well and truly understands our geography, the benefits and the tensions in this region of the world. We are, of course, a very strong and staunch ally of the United States. We've needed over a long period of time to work on our relationship with China as China has continued to rise as a global force. It falls to every Prime Minister to balance those two, and sometimes they are more easily put in balance, sometimes finding that is more complicated. But I'm very confident that over the sweep of many years, so this isn't a commentary about the current government, over the sweep of many years that Australia will continue to navigate its way productively through any tensions that arise.
You've devoted a lot of your time after leaving office to education. Now, UN Secretary General António Guterres says up to 1 billion children have had their schooling affected by the pandemic. How do you make sure that the world's most vulnerable children don't get left behind?
One of the many hats I wear is as chair of the Global Partnership for Education, which is the global body that focuses on school education in developing countries. And we're very concerned because the evidence from past epidemics like Ebola is that if schools close, the most marginalised children, particularly the most marginalised girls, never get back to school when they reopen. They end up as child brides or child labourers, and that's it, that's school done for them. And so we've been working in this period with developing country partners to try and maintain educational continuity. Now, for many children in Australia, in other parts of the world, educational continuity is about, technology, it's about video conferencing, all of that. In the parts of the world where we work, it's much more about old-fashioned solutions, not new technology solutions. So it's radio, television, the distribution of print materials to children. So we've been working on that. And then we will be working with developing country partners so that as schools reopen, there is tracing, there's ways of making sure every child returns and is supported to return and is supported to make up whatever gap in their education has emerged because they've been out of school for that period.
Huge job. I also had wanted to ask you about mental health. You've spoken about how mental health is really taking a hit because of the pandemic. And you've also lived through some really tough times in your life. Can you share some lessons with viewers out there? How do you get through this?
Yeah, I think this is a uniquely tough time in the sense that we're you know, we're social creatures where people need people, as the old song would tell us. People do need people. And if you're feeling very isolated, particularly if you live alone and you're in quite stringent lockdown conditions, so you're really not having any face-to-face interaction with other human beings of a, you know, deep or meaningful connection, that does weigh heavily on people. And whilst, you know, new technology can provide some sort of substitute, we all know that it's not quite the same as being in a physical presence where you can share a hug and really be human beings in a moment together. So we are saying to people, and when I say we, I chair Australia's major mental health body, Beyond Blue, a major advocacy body. We are saying to people, if you feel that you're getting into trouble, don't wait to reach out for support. Reach out to family, friends, but also to mental health agencies and bodies, because early intervention, prevention makes a profound difference. So don't wait until it's really in a very dark place before you first reach out for help. For me, in my life, you know, I've always been able to rely on the support of family and friends. That's what's got me through, and I'm conscious that that's what's most missing for people during lockdown conditions now. But I'm also a big believer that resilience is a muscle, that you can work it. So, you know, early trials and challenges in my life enabled me to think through not only what it was like to take a fall, but what it was like to get back up. And my advice to anyone now as they go through their life journey is, you know, no matter how mild the setback, think about it, think about how you're going to respond to it. And then as you work your way through that, then when the setbacks are more profoundly challenging, you will have worked that resilience muscle and got it a bit stronger.
Former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Kim.
While the world tests for the virus is testing us all. At DBS, it's testing our ability to think, feel, and act beyond ourselves. That's when we see portraits of courage, perseverance, and generosity. These are the portraits of purpose we're creating to bring more of what the world needs today, for all of us, for all our tomorrows, together.
Welcome back to Time 100 Talks. I'm Dan Maxey, Executive Editor at Time and Editorial Director of the Time 100. Let's keep this episode going with another great conversation between my colleague, Time Books editor Lucy Feldman, and actress Michelle Yeoh. Lucy?
Thank you, Dan. And hi, I'm Lucy Feldman, books editor for Time, and I'm so excited to talk about global leadership and representation in Hollywood with legendary actor Michelle Yeoh. Hi, Michelle.
Hey. Hello, Lucy. Right off the bat, I want to say it's such a privilege to be here with you today.
Oh, well, it's such a privilege to have you, truly. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your shooting schedule. I know you're actually working right now, which is more than a lot of us can say, at least for in person. What is that like? I have to know. You're in Australia, you're shooting a movie. What is a post-pandemic set like?
Ooh, well, you know, these are just unprecedented times, right? We have been invaded by a pandemic, every part of the world, there's no escaping it, and it's impacting everyone. And if we are really honest, we know we can't go back to the normal ways, the old ways. We are going to have to live and find ways to be strong enough and face the fact that this is the new way of living, and how do we get back to that, but in a very safe and sensible way. And I shared my travels from Paris to Sydney because I wanted to, everyone, this is a global battle. We are in this together, and we have to help each other understand how we can keep ourselves safe and our friends, our families, our co-workers, our communities safe. By covering up, by wearing a mask. I mean, it's not a political statement. It's a powerful weapon that keeps us safe. And we had a face shield and all the way, okay, I'm a wimp. Call me a wimp, but I would put sanitizer all on my seats, on my chair. I had an air purifier if I ever took my mask off. And then, you know, when we were in quarantine, we were tested. And I wanted to show, I posted a photo of myself doing the really big, deep virus test. It's quite invasive, not like bad, but necessary. Because when you can test it, then you know, and then you can trace it. And then when we are on set, I'm very proud to see they are writing the playbook as they go along, and what they are doing, the steps that they are taking to ensure the safety of everyone. Because we know that it's just a matter of time. We need to get back to work. We need to go back to school. We need to go to some normalcy of lifestyle. But how do we do it right? And I think these are the right measures that we are doing. You only see the eyes of people now. And people do say eyes are the windows to your soul, right? And then we get tested 3 times a week. But necessary.
3 times a week, wow.
3 times a week. Because, you know, we are not living in a bubble. Because we need everybody to have the mindset of looking after each other. It's not just about me doing this. I need you, I need my friends, I need the people that I meet on the streets, that they are also mindful of this is how we are going to protect each other and be the hero that we all want.
We have to talk about what it is that you're filming, of course.
No.
Well,
it will come out when the time is right.
let me just fill in some blanks for those who might not understand why you wouldn't want to talk about what you're filming. I'm pretty sure, and I'll just put this in my own words, that you are in Australia because Shang-Chi is filming, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, which is a Marvel movie, obviously a huge deal. Can you tell us anything about your character on this project? She's pleading the mask. Okay.
Yeah, I'm pleading the mask.
Very, very sly of you, Michelle. Well, okay, how about this? How about this question?
No, not going
I know
there.
you have, well, I'm gonna ask it. I know you have history of doing your own stunts, and that is an amazing part of your career and something that you're absolutely lauded for. It's incredible. Will we, at some point soon, see you in some sort of daredevil action scenes?
Well, you will see me in season 3 of Star Trek Discovery, which will air October 15th. And then just before the lockdown in LA, I finished up a movie called Everything Everywhere All at Once. And I do some crazy action stuff in there with the legendary Jamie Lee Curtis. I love her. She's so amazing. She is a true legend.
She
and
is
a great
also
voice for women. She fights for social injustice. She's my kind of gal.
Well, this is wonderful and a very skilled diversion. And I do want to come back to Star Trek Discovery, which is very important. But just to stay on this topic for one moment more, and we can speak in hypotheticals, you can speak as an audience member. Obviously, Shang-Chi is a very exciting project because it will be the first Marvel movie that has a predominantly Asian cast, and that's a big deal. What does that mean to you, if not as an actor who is potentially involved in the film, as an audience member?
You're amazing. You're relentless, aren't you? Well, the thing is, when that was announced last year, and they introduced who they were doing the Marvel superhero, and a Chinese, an Asian superhero. And it was like, yes, finally, you know, when do we get to be represented like that? When Crazy Rich Asians came out, it changed the map. It changed the whole way Asians were represented and seen. We were no longer invisible. We were no longer just a token. We were real. We were really represented in a contemporary, in today, not just in, you know, period pieces or, you know, that's flying across rooftops or something like that. But where little girls, little boys, they look up and go, oh my God, I can see there's me up there. And that is very, very important. I mean, I remember when I first arrived in Hollywood, and I'm very blessed. I started my career in Hong Kong, and I come from Malaysia, where I grew up seeing my face being like the superhero or the romantic lead, or be part of real stories on the silver screen, on TV and everything. But once I got to America, I was like, I am really a minority here, and I have no representation. And one of the worst things was I felt every time there was a role to be read, it was so stereotypical of the Chinese girl in Chinatown, or the waitress, or the, the old cliches. And I fought against that for a very long time, because I felt I had the luxury of saying, no, I will not endorse these kind of roles. But I can totally understand where there are so many actors and actresses who need to work for a living and to be able to be part of this whole community in Hollywood. And I think the turning point really came when I did the James Bond movie, and when Barbara Broccoli, Jeff Kleeman, they turn around and say, yes, you should be on par with James Bond. And it was a proud moment, because here is a Chinese woman who is standing side to side, toe to toe with the greatest spy in the world, James Bond. And it made such a huge difference in the way we Asians were looked at. And it's something that I advocate for, I fight for all the day and all the times. And now when I receive a script and they say to me, oh, don't worry, it's actually written for a guy, but we are going to change it. So you feel now they really see us, and they see us as equals. And I think that's what we are fighting for, is equal opportunities to be represented in the truest form and tell our stories. So yes, going back to Shang-Chi, I was very happy that they were finally doing a Asian superhero. Well done, Marvel.
Well done indeed. And it's a great sort of next step, after I know that Marvel has come into some criticism for whitewashing characters that were Asian in original comics. So this is...
I think quite a few companies went through that part of the whitewashing for many years, and I remember when I first went to Hollywood, and that was what they would normally do. First, a romantic lead, which is Asian. I don't think you ever saw one until Crazy Rich Asians. And then to put two minorities together to tell an Asian story, ridiculous. It wasn't something that they would even entertain. But I think at the end of the day, for example, when Crazy Rich Asians came out, and it was so embraced, not just only by the Asian community, but it was a very relatable story. And that's what we're asking for. We are very relatable to you because we are one race.
I love that you bring up Crazy Rich Asians. Obviously, it was a huge success. And just speaking personally about exactly what you're describing, I went to the theater and I did not expect to be as moved as I was to see people who looked like me. And it just felt like such an aha moment for me, realizing that this is what we talk about when we say that representation matters.
Right. It is. It was a huge moment in history, and I'm so proud to be part of that. I'm really proud of our producers, Nina Jacobson and John Ganotti, because they heard us. They heard John Chu. They heard that it's about family, it's about love, it's about acceptance, and that is very universal. We are talking a universal language that transcends color, whatever. And I think that at the crux of it, that was where John Chu really delivered a beautiful rom-com. Yes, it was light, it was fun, but at the same time, it had real, true emotions and feelings. And I think everyone who was cast in there recognized these characters. Oh yeah, that's my mom. Oh yeah, that's my auntie, and this and that. So and it had integrity. Because yes, we have the stereotypical geeky or over the top families. Yes, we do have that. But I think it's very important that you don't just laugh at us and make us stereotypes. We can laugh together because we find ourselves funny too. And I think that's the most important thing, is like we live in this world together. We need to look after each other, and we need to see each other for who we are and accept who we are.
This seems like a wonderful moment to sort of transition to talk about your work with the UN. You are a UNDP Goodwill ambassador, and with the UN, you do work on raising awareness on issues like gender inequality and poverty.
Yes.
Various other things. You're very active with them. Tell me a bit about what that advocacy looks like for you.
Actually, that being asked to be a UNDP Goodwill ambassador came at a really perfect opportunity, because prior to that, I was advocating for AIDS, particularly for road safety. And the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, came out from 2015 to 2030. And for the longest of time with road safety, where we have 1.3 million who die every year on the roads. 500 children die every day just because they're trying to get to school. And so this, for me, for the last more than a decade, we were knocking on doors and asking people to listen to us, hear us. And only in 2015, finally, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon nominated my partner Jean Todt as the Special Envoy for Road Safety, which was so necessary for our advocacy, because it shone the light on what is road safety? Why is this something that we are hearing about it now? And it is included in one of the SDGs Goal 11, part of the sustainable cities. So when they asked me, UNDP asked me to be their Goodwill ambassador, I thought this was the perfect opportunity, because they are working on all the things that I've been trying so hard to work with. And they have been a group of people who have been around the world in many countries, who have a solid base and understanding what were the necessary issues that we were dealing with. And I think for me, the closest to my heart, the eradication of poverty, which is the first sustainable development goal, which means also eradication of poverty and hunger, and then gender inequality, which is goal 5, which is something that I advocate very, very strongly for. Because if we don't have that, if we don't acknowledge the other half of the population, then we will never be able to achieve our goals. If we don't work hand in hand as a man and a woman, the two genders or more genders, or the difference in the different genders that now we have, we are not going to be able to eradicate poverty, hunger, have equality in education, and the basic things where we can make our world a better, more resilient place for our future generations.
The pandemic has really exacerbated a lot of problems with inequality, really shined a light on where we need to do much better around the world. How has that impacted your priorities and your work with the UN?
Well, in the past years, there has been a progress towards, and when the COVID hit, it just all went backwards. And like you say, it exacerbated the inequalities, the extreme poverty, which was 100 million people, now immediately becomes so much more. And they highlight the issues that we are dealing with, the adversity that we are facing. I think at the moment, the UNDP, they have come together, they've written up documents on how we can deal with this on a very high level, which is with the governments, the temporary basic income fund, where they will try and help people who can't even put food on the table. So these are things that they are working on right now. And personally, I think at the moment is, the minute I get a chance, I will go back out, because we have many brave individuals who are facing and doing it sensibly and safely, delivering food or essentials and things to the people who are in great need of that. I hope to be able to join them back again soon on this quest, and I hope that more of us will do our part, because this is a moment in history that is never going to be forgotten. And I would like us to feel that I have been one that participated and did good, because we need to do this together.
You've also been really great at using your social media and just your platform as a public-facing person to talk about the issues that are important to you. And I saw a video that you made sort of connecting your support for the Black Lives Matter movement with your Star Trek fan base.
Yes, I strongly support Black Lives Matter movement and its bold efforts to stop racial injustice and inequality. We are in this fight together.
I would love if you wouldn't mind just sort of walking through that argument and how you think Star Trek in particular can help move these conversations forward.
Well, if you know the Star Trek world, it is one that has, in the future, there will be we don't talk about race. We are one world. And there will be no discrimination against color and nothing. And so it's been such a privilege to work on a set where it's complete diversity in every sense of the word. And we deal very directly with social injustice and how equality, how we can save the universe. So it is amazing to be part of a show where we think and we face the problems. And I think that's what we need, is like being strong, being able to be strong and confident enough to say, I would like to join with you and let you hear my voice. And at that time, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, this is the moment where we came as people together, voicing the same social injustice and wanting to see things done right. And with my Star Trek family, it was great because we have this Trek United campaign, and where we help to pay, this group pays for the legal fees for cases where they need to receive legal advice and justice.
And what is the status of this spin-off starring you as your character,
Emperor Yeoh? Yes, it is true. I am very, very proud. And I think it is very important. Alex Kurtzman, Heather, Aaron, my showrunners, and Craig, and Erica and Bowie, the writers and showrunners of this show, they're plodding along. And I think it is very important. Like to have the Emperor as an Asian woman. I think that's big time. I'm really looking forward to that and having fun on it. That's the most important thing. And saving the universe, of course.
Of course, there's always that. As we're talking about all of these various topics, I'm starting to wonder how you find the time to balance all of this.
I love what I do. I think we all have to have dreams, but we need to have goals. And I find that you have to have passion, and I really love what I do. And I think it shows. And then when you are doing it, it's easy. It doesn't just become a job. You are there because it fulfills you as a person, and I can use it as an enormous, huge platform to reach out and to hopefully, with the strong characters that I play, to give hope and think, well, look, I can be that strong character too. Even though I'm Asian, I can be a captain. Oh, I can be an emperor. I can be, hey, vice president as well in a real way. And, it gives them a sense of well-being to believe there is light at the end of the tunnel and there is hope. And I am able to find it also in me because I have been inspired by someone who did it. And I think that keeps me going and doing more, because that's what I hope to do. And when I look and I see in the news or a movie or a TV series where these strong characters and they speak to they inspire me. They inspire me to be a better person. They inspire me to say, yes, I have a voice and I am going to use it. And I think that is what we do.
Well, that seems like the perfect point to end our conversation on. All the things that give you hope. Obviously, we're all looking for some hope right now, and it's inspiring to hear you talk about it.
Yes, yes. We have to fight this together, and only together we can win this. So please wear your mask, take your temperature, do all the right things, social distancing, you know, we can get through this, but we just have to do it together. We need global solidarity. We need to share good practices. We really need to do this for us. And this is a transformational opportunity for change, for good change, that our world can be better, more resilient and sustainable. So.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It was so wonderful talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy and Michelle, for that great conversation. Now, I would like to welcome back Red Velvet, IRENE and SEULGI, with a performance of their song, Monster.
움직임은 특이해 평범치 않아 1 to 5 to 7 난 어둠 속에 댄서 온몸 뚝뚝 꺾어 침대 가까이 갈게 무시무시하게 내 심장을 훔쳐 지배해 하나의 조명 왜 그림자는 두드려 날 속에 다른 게 눈을 뜬 것 같아 I'm a little monster. I'm a little monster. 차가운 땅 잿더미에서 일어났어. 황혼에서 새벽 난 여전히 존재해. 이 광기가 싫지 않아. 즐기고 있는 걸 넌 벗어날 수 없어. 도망가지를 마 다쳐. 널 원하고 도로에 걸리고 오늘 완벽하고 다시 엉망인걸 I'm a little monster like a man 널 괴롭혀 내 꿈만 꾸게 해난 춤추고 놀래 가을 뚫린 너의 그 몸 위에 줄을 걸면 I'm a little monster I'm a little monster I'm a little monster.
Thank you, Red Velvet, IRENE and SEULGI, for that awesome performance, and thanks to all of our guests for joining us today. I would also like to thank our partner, DBS, for all the work they've done to make these important conversations possible. If you haven't already done so, make sure to subscribe to Time at time.com/subscribe. For more information on TIME100 Talks, past or future episodes, check out our website at time.com/time100 Talks. We'll be back this Thursday, August 20th, with a great show featuring superstar athletes discussing the future of sports. You don't want to miss it. Until then, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.